All right, if you have your Bible, you can turn to Mark chapter 5. We are going to talk about a hindrance to receiving, or I guess a better way to say it would be one way to avoid being hindered. Remember a few weeks ago I mentioned John G. Lake, and he was the guy who they put the plague in his hand and the germs died. And he said that one of the main reasons people don't receive healing or miracles is because of their passivity, meaning they just don't really care enough. They're not aggressive enough in receiving, and that's what we're going to talk about tonight, is being aggressive in receiving what God has provided. And we see an example of this. Actually, we see an example of several of the laws of faith that are in operation here in Mark chapter 5, verse 25, and we'll read through verse 34. It says, "Now a certain woman had a flow of blood for 12 years, and had suffered many things from many physicians. She had spent all that she had and was no better, but rather grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came behind him in the crowd and touched his garment. For she said, 'If I only may touch his clothes, I shall be made well.' Immediately the fountain of her blood was dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of the affliction. And Jesus, immediately knowing in himself that power had gone out of him, turned around in the crowd and said, 'Who touched my clothes?' But his disciples said to him, 'You see the multitude thronging you, and you ask, "Who touched me?' And he looked around to see her who had done this thing. But the woman, fearing and trembling, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, 'Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your affliction.'" So there are a lot of things that we can take from this passage. It's a familiar passage to us. We've heard this many times. But we see here that the woman is cooperating with the laws of faith. But here in verse 30, we see that Jesus asks, "Who touched my clothes?" And so this may be an unpopular opinion. I've heard arguments to the contrary, but I believe that Jesus was not omniscient in the earth. He didn't know everything. He was 100% God and 100% man, but he was operating as a man, and he certainly knew a lot of things that a normal person would not know in the natural, but that's, I believe, because the Holy Spirit would reveal things to him, just like he will reveal things to us. And over in Luke chapter 2, verse 52, it says that Jesus grew in wisdom and stature. And when I was in Bible college, they taught that Jesus had to learn about himself. He had to learn who he was, that he was the Son of God, by studying the Scriptures. And so we see that he actually quotes the book of Isaiah where it talks about him. And so I don't believe that Jesus was omniscient, and therefore I don't believe that he really knew who touched him here. And that's why he was asking, "Who touched his clothes?" But regardless, whether you think he was or was not omniscient, the truth remains here that this woman put the laws of faith into action. And as a result, the healing power of God automatically flowed. So often when Christians pray, or when they're believing God for something, they look at it as if God is standing there trying to determine whether or not to heal the person or provide the thing that they are asking for. But that's not what happens. Just as we talked about this 2 weeks ago, as there are laws, physical laws established in the earth, like gravity, there are also supernatural laws which are established. And just as we cooperate with gravity, the law of gravity, in order to reap its benefits, we can also cooperate with supernatural laws like the law of faith or laws of faith, and then reap the benefits of those laws. And so this woman cooperated with the laws of faith. She put them into action, and as a result, healing power automatically flowed, even though Jesus did not know who touched his garment. She was just taking advantage of the established laws. So this woman acted on her faith. We're in Mark chapter 5, by the way, 5 verses 25 through 34, when the woman with the issue of blood came up behind Jesus and touched the hem of his garment. So this woman acted on her faith, and we've talked about this before, that faith will move a person to action. We sometimes say that faith is action, based upon belief, sustained by confidence. And actions or works are important, and they are an important aspect of receiving and operating in faith. Because James chapter 2, verse 20 says that faith without works is dead. Now we take that in context. We know that the action itself is not what causes us to receive. And really, works or actions do not always prove that a person has faith. Now James also says, show me your faith without your works, and I will show you my faith by my works, which means that works can be a proof that a person has faith, but that is not always the case because people can act without faith. And one of the errors in the church is that people believe if they will act, even if they don't have faith, then they will receive, and then they get themselves into a big mess because they are trying to act in faith that is not there, or in a faith that they have not learned to use. And I've got a guy at work, actually a couple of guys at work. We occasionally talk about theological issues, and one of the guys is just, I don't know what his denomination is in particular, but he's very knowledgeable about the Bible. We don't get mad at each other or get into arguments or anything, but one of the guys is Catholic, and so the people that believe, more Protestant, people like me and this other guy, who I assume goes to some denominational church, we often disagree with the guy who's Catholic, but we can all discuss these things and not get, angry at each other and start screaming. But we were talking to this Catholic guy one day, and he was talking about how works are so important, and he actually said that works prove that you have faith. And that's a recurring theme with Catholics. They put a very large emphasis on the works and not on the faith that is behind the works. Faith should always be what moves you to a work. You're not focused on the work in order to prove that you have faith. Although if a person truly does have faith, then they will have accompanying works. And this woman had faith, and it drove her to action, which was to go into this crowd and touch the hem of Jesus' garment. And so Matthew chapter 9 is where it talks about touching the hem of his garment. It just says touching his clothes here in Mark. But the only logical explanation for why she would be touching the hem of his garment, which would be near the ground, is because she was most likely crawling through this crowd to reach out and touch the garment. And so you can imagine crawling through a crowd. And when I was younger, you guys were just talking about music and aggressive music. When I was younger, I was in a band, and we were a little more aggressive with our music style, loud guitars and drums, and we had a bass guitarist and a singer, and then the bass player would sing and the drummer would sing. But we played pretty aggressive music, and we would go to a venue in Nashville called Rocketown, which was actually founded by Michael W. Smith many years ago, but that's where all of the bands who played that style of music would go and have concerts. And so we would go down there frequently and see our favorite bands. And it wasn't like a concert at Bridgestone, where you have a designated seat and you might be really far away or you might be on the front row, but you're confined to that seat. You can't, stray from that location. But when you go to Rocketown or some of these other small venues, there is no seating. It's just an open area with a stage. And then everybody pays the general admission. And if you want to get up close, then you better get there early so that you can get a good spot up front. And then you might even need to fight for it because people are going to be kind of pushing against you, trying to get up as close as they can. And we went to our first show there. We had never been to a show of that style of music before. And before the bands come out, all the lights are on. They're playing some music over the speakers. And then right before the band comes out, the lights go down. The stage lights come on, the music stops, and the whole crowd just presses forward, trying to get as close as they can. And it was the most disgusting, it was probably the worst show that we had ever been to as far as just how gross it was, because we were there in this huge crowd for like 4 hours, just pressed right up against somebody. Everybody's hot and sweating, and by the end, we looked like we had just stepped out of a swimming pool with our clothes on. And we could probably wring out the sweat if we had tried from our clothes. And most of it wasn't even ours because we were just pressed up against other people the whole time. And so we would joke about it. We got in that car, there's 5 of us. We got in the car afterwards, and it was the worst smell I've ever smelled in my life. We would talk about it for years afterwards. When something gross happened, we'd be like, oh, that smells worse than Rocketown. And then there was, everybody was just so thirsty because you were out there for like 4 hours, sweating profusely, no drink anywhere. And then every so often, someone would go buy a bottle of water and just fling it out into the crowd. One person would take a sip and then fling it over to somebody else. And then by the end, you just got a little bit of backwash in that thing. And, terrible. Absolutely disgusting. But good shows. But I was thinking about that crowd, especially that first show that we went to, because I don't think we've ever experienced anything like that before, where the crowd just pushed as hard as they could up to the front, and you couldn't move. You were just like crammed against somebody, unable to move, your face probably laying on their bare back with their sweat all over your face. There's no way to get to the front by pushing, because everybody's trying to get to the front. And so the only way that you can get to the front, if you were brave enough, would be to get down on the floor and crawl to the front. And that's going to be painful. People are going to be mad at you. They might step on your hands or your fingers. Might even kick you if they're an angry person. But there is no other way to get to the front in that kind of a crowd. And we see that Jesus here had a huge crowd around him, a multitude of people. And this woman's trying to get to him, but everybody else is also trying to get to him. And so the only way that she could actually get to him is to get down on the ground and crawl and just try to touch the hem of his garment, which means that she was probably getting kicked and stepped on, and people were probably yelling at her, telling her to go away. And keep in mind that this was also under the Old Testament, because Jesus had not died and been resurrected yet. So this woman was considered unclean, and everyone that she touched was considered unclean, and so she could have been stoned for this action, which shows that she had a characteristic of operating in faith, which is earnestness or aggressiveness. Now, aggressiveness doesn't mean anger and hostility, but it means I'm going to do whatever it takes to receive. And so she wasn't going to let anything stop her from reaching out and touching the hem of his garment. Because we can't receive things from God just by passively seeking them. Jeremiah 29:13 says that you will seek me and find me if you search for me with all your heart. And God looks at the heart. And if we're just praying about something one moment and then we go about our day, we never think about it again, and we can take it or leave it, whether or not we actually receive it, then we're not going to receive what it is that we're praying about. And this is the point that I'm trying to make tonight. As long as you can live without your healing, or whatever it is that God has provided for you, whether it's healing or finances, we talked about the power to get wealth, joy, peace. As long as you can live without these things, then you will live without them. And I think that is prevalent here in the United States and developed countries in particular, because it's very easy for us to live in comfort without living in God's best. So, for example, I'm wearing glasses tonight. I did that intentionally, not to, lift up the enemy or anything. But I'm going to talk a lot tonight about my vision, because I had an experience a few years ago, which I'll explain. But it's much easier for me to put on a pair of glasses and see perfectly. I can actually see better than 20/20 when I'm wearing glasses or contacts. And it's much more convenient in the physical for me to just put on a pair of glasses or put in my contact lenses, rather than having to stand in faith and be aggressive about receiving perfect vision, which I know is already provided for me in the spirit realm. And I'm talking about vision, but that can also go for healing. I just mentioned finances a moment ago. It's easy to take a pill rather than standing in faith to believe that some ailment is healed. It's easy to sit at home and get a check from the government that just barely lets you get by, rather than going out and putting your hands to work, knowing that you are anointed to prosper. And I talked to my boss about that yesterday morning. He said, the main reason by far that we are having trouble keeping people is because they just don't want to work. They will get the job, they'll show up for a couple of days, and then they either point out, which is where they don't show up on time for enough days, and then they get fired, or they just quit showing up altogether, and then they get fired. And he said, he told me what we're paying them, and he said we're not competitive with our wages, so we're working on a different leveling system where people can start at a certain level, and then after a certain amount of time, they get a raise and so on. And I was thinking, man, I can't believe that is not a competitive wage, because I remember my first job in high school and I was making $6.50 an hour, and I thought that was amazing. And we're paying almost 3 times that where I work now, and that's not considered competitive. And even with that pay, people don't want to work. They'll get a job and then they just quit showing up because they can get by. They can be comfortable enough to get by just from whatever the government will give them. But that's not how God intends for us to work. We are empowered to prosper. We're anointed to prosper, but we have to put our hands to some sort of work. And so we're very good in this country about being comfortable in living in less than what God has provided for us. And I don't remember who the minister was, but I was reading about someone who had he had many healing movements through third world countries in South America, Central America, and some of the African countries. And someone asked him, or he actually made the statement, that it's so much easier for them to receive healing and miracles and all these things than it is for people in the United States and in European countries. And someone asked him why that is, and he said it's because they don't have an alternate like we do here, whereas I can put on a pair of glasses or a pair of contacts and I can see perfectly. If I take off my glasses, I currently cannot read this piece of paper here. And so if I were in a country where I didn't have access to optometrists, then it would be detrimental to my livelihood. I would have difficulty finding a job. And even if I could find a job, it would be a struggle constantly trying to read, because I can see far away without glasses, but I have difficulty reading up close, which is actually a rare situation for someone my age. But people in these countries, they don't have the option to go take a pill or get a surgery or get a pair of glasses. And so when they hear the truth that healing has already been provided for them, they grab onto that aggressively, and they're not going to let it go. And so it's much easier for them to stand in faith and receive that than it is for us to stand in faith, because we have this convenience to fall back on. Now, I can't remember when this was. It was 2 or 3 years ago, I guess probably 2019 or 2020. We were in Florida, or maybe it was Gulf Shores. Our family went down there to the beach. And I remember I was sitting in the room, and I was actually reading this book by Andrew Womack about the imagination. And throughout this book, he's talking about experiences that he had with people receiving healing. And as I was reading these events in this book, I could tell that faith was being strengthened, and I didn't need to wear my glasses. And so I took my glasses off, and I was actually able to read this book even without glasses or contacts in. And I did it for about 30 minutes to another hour after that. And looking at it now, looking at it before then, I would not be able to read this page without glasses or contacts in. But in that moment, it wasn't perfect. It was still a little bit out of focus, but I could read comfortably without glasses or contacts because of the faith that had been strengthened by reading those events. And so I mentioned early on in this study that God's best, of course, is immediate, complete healing, but there are times that we will receive over time, gradually. And so I believe that what was happening there is I had received healing for my vision, but it was taking some time to gradually get to perfection because of where my faith had been. And so we were about to go out to dinner that night, and I got to thinking, I don't know what the lighting in the restaurant's going to be or how small the print's going to be. My vision isn't quite perfect yet. So I just put on my glasses or put my contacts in, I can't remember which, and I was like, I'm still receiving the healing, so I'll just put these on and then get by, the meal, and then I'll come back to it later and continue to receive my healing. And then, of course, I just became passive. And then I don't even know if I tried to read again after that without using glasses. And then probably a year later, I was like, let me see if I can read that book. And I took my glasses off, couldn't read a page, because I had become passive in my receiving. I was not aggressive enough to hold on to what had already been provided and what I was actually seeing the manifestation of. And so I have no doubt at all that healing is still available right now. The fact that I'm wearing glasses did not change the truth that the healing is provided and it's already available for me. It's just waiting for me to stand in faith and get aggressive about receiving it. And so I'm talking about myself a lot tonight, but we can apply this to probably everyone in here in some way. If you're on some sort of medication, if you're dealing with some sort of a lack or some kind of emotional issue, it's easier for us to just be comfortable and get by than it is for us to inconvenience ourselves and stand in faith and renew our minds to the Word and be aggressive about receiving what we know is true. And we can have faith. We're going to talk more about this next week, about faith and unbelief. We can actually have faith 100% that God has provided healing for us or whatever it is that we're believing for, but still be passive to the point that we're not receiving. We're not seeing the manifestation of it. But when you are aggressive about what you know, then you will receive. And we see that with this woman here, when she was aggressively pursuing what she knew to be true. Her faith was hooked up to the fact that if she would touch the hem of his garment, then she would be healed. And then in verse 25, it says, a certain woman had a flow of blood for 12 years and had suffered many things from many physicians. She had spent all that she had and was no better but grew worse. So she had spent 12 years and all of her money and gone through who knows what, trying to get this thing cured in the natural realm. And it had not done any good. And so because of that, it's like I was talking about a moment ago with these third world countries where there is no alternative. She got to the point that she was not going to accept that anymore. She wasn't falling back on some level of comfort. She was going to aggressively pursue or aggressively act as a result of her faith. And today, people will let doctors and the medical field do all kinds of things to them, just like this woman 2,000 years ago. You look at some of the treatments today, for example, cancer, right? People get chemotherapy because of cancer, and it's a lot more complicated than this, but basically you are destroying your tissue, hoping that the cancerous tissue is destroyed before you die. And it's a very, I guess, barbaric treatment. And we've seen with COVID, I know a lot about COVID treatments. The treatment of choice for the medical field was if you get COVID, then stay home until you can't breathe and then come to the hospital. We'll give you remdesivir and put you on a ventilator. And at that point, it's basically a coin flip to determine whether you live or not. There's no data at all to show that remdesivir helps treat COVID. And yet that was the main treatment that was given to people that had COVID. And there are many others that had been proven to be more successful that were being denied. And I have no doubt that many people, hundreds of thousands of people died because of this incorrect treatment. People who could be alive today if they had been treated correctly. And I dated a girl who, I dated two people from the medical field. One was a medical doctor. The other was a physical therapist. And they told me some stories about professionals in the medical field that would shock you. Because even in a great hospital like Vanderbilt, which is where one of the people that I dated was from, or was working with, we kind of hold that up as a very prestigious university, and the medical system there is supposed to be top-notch. And she would tell me things that happened there that are just inexcusable mistakes, people that are having a bad day, maybe they're just not good at their jobs, and so they make mistakes. And then like I was talking about with COVID, sometimes there's some sort of a bias that's keeping people from providing the correct assistance or treatments. So we don't put our faith in the medical field. Now, we don't deny it. We don't quit taking medicine or deny a surgery. I had 4 surgeries on my hand 7 years ago. I had a surgery for appendicitis before that when I was in South Carolina, attending some training, and then my parents had to come down and get me out of the hospital after that happened. We don't deny services of the medical field, but we don't put our faith in those things. And again, God's best is that we wouldn't need those, and really it's His best is that we shouldn't ever get sick in the first place. But if we are putting our faith in people or in the medical field, then we are really setting ourselves up for failure because they are people just like us. They make mistakes. We can pray whenever we're going into a surgery or whenever we're taking some medication that it will do what it's designed to do and that the doctors will do what they intend to do and there won't be any ill effects. But we put our faith in God, not in man, and not in the medical field. And so, whenever someone today trusts God for healing, they are considered crazy. And yet, whenever they are going to the medical field for something like chemotherapy, that's considered reasonable, even though they're basically destroying their bodies. So we need to look at our situations differently than what the world does, because our faith is not in man. Our faith is in God. And whenever we get aggressive, like this woman was about receiving, then we are going to receive what God has provided for us. But if we can live without it, then we will not receive it. So this woman was moved to action because of her faith, and that's the important part here. Your actions must be based on faith. We don't perform a work to prove that we have faith, although works can be proof that we have faith. But there are times that a work or an action can be empty. There can be no faith behind it. But true faith will move us to work. And so your faith should move you to act, even if it's inconvenient, like with this woman having to press through this crowd and get down on the floor or the ground and probably get kicked and stepped on, even risking her life to receive, but she was so aggressive about receiving her healing that she took that step and she would not let anything get in the way. And so while I was talking about my vision, it's up to me to get that same kind of tenacity where I'm going to renew my mind to the truth. That perfect vision is already provided. Deuteronomy talks about Moses when he was 120 years old, and he actually climbed a mountain when he was 120 years old. It said his body was not weak, his eyesight was not dim. And so I need to renew my mind to that truth and then get aggressive about hanging on to that and not letting anything get in the way of me and what God has provided. And the same can be true about medication or finances or emotions. Now that does not mean that we stop taking our medicine because we're believing that we're healed. It doesn't mean that we go out and buy a house that we can't afford because we're expecting God to provide a house for us. Now, if the Holy Spirit ever moves you to do something, then do it. So if you better be sure it's the Holy Spirit, but if He moves on you and leads you to buy a house, then go for it. If He leads you to stop taking medicine, then go for it. But absolutely don't get out in front of your faith and stop taking medicine because you're believing that you're healed when you don't actually have the faith to receive it. So if you're not going to go buy a house that you can't afford, then what can you do to act on your faith? I think my dad shared this post on the church's Facebook a while back, talking about Isaac Petrie. He said, sometimes you need to act like you've got something in order to get it. And that's true, because acting, as we've seen, is a component of living by faith. If you truly have faith in something, then you will act on it. And that's what a lot of that book talks about, talking about the imagination. Because maybe the action for you is using your imagination to envision yourself with what you have. So if you don't have the money to go buy a house, but you're believing God for a house, then you can start imagining yourself in a house. You can start looking up houses that you would like to buy, imagining how you would decorate them, seeing yourself mowing the lawn, if that's what you're into, eating in the kitchen, cooking in the kitchen. You can use your imagination to see all these things and raise your expectation so that you know that God is going to provide it for you, and you're anxiously or excitedly waiting for that moment to manifest. And so it takes this type of aggressive attitude like this woman had to receive effectively from God. Now this woman put a number of the laws of faith into action. She was speaking, right? She was saying to herself, if I can touch the hem of his garment, I'll be healed. Her heart was in agreement with her mouth. We talked about that last week, that what you say, your heart has to agree with in order for it to be effective. And she was acting on her faith. She was so confident in what she was saying and what her faith was saying that she actually moved down into this crowd and would not let anything stop her from touching his garment. And so when she touched that garment, the healing power flowed automatically to her. Now, it was God's power that healed her, but it was her faith which caused that power to flow. And so God wasn't sitting there watching this woman trying to determine whether or not he was going to heal her. And as we saw, it looks like Jesus did not even know who touched his garment because there was such a crowd. So he wasn't trying to determine whether he was going to heal her. The woman simply took advantage of and cooperated with the supernatural laws of faith which God had already established. And so just like if I drop this bottle of water, it's going to fall to the ground because of the law of gravity. If I will cooperate with the established laws of faith, then I'm going to receive what God has already provided. That's established. And so verse 34 here says, Jesus speaks to her and says, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your affliction." So again, it is God's power, the healing power that was flowing to this woman, but it was her faith which caused that to happen, which means that it is up to us. So just like with my vision again, the healing has already been provided. The fact that I'm wearing glasses does not change the truth that it is already available. But it's completely up to me to act in faith to receive that which has already been provided. And so our faith does not even move God, although we often hear that. Our faith, Andrew Womack puts it this way, our faith is a positive response to what God has already done for us. And so he has already given healing by grace, and then we respond to that in faith in order to bring that into a physical manifestation. But it's all up to us. He's already provided what we need. And so if I'm wearing glasses, or we're taking some kind of medication, or we are living below what God intends for us to live, then that is 100% on us. We need to get aggressive about receiving what he has provided for us. So receiving from God is not about how he feels toward you. We saw that with this woman. She was just cooperating with the established laws of faith. Because if it were only up to God and how he feels about us, then everybody would be perfect and nobody would have a need. There would be no sickness. Nobody would be living below what he intends. Because that's what God wants for everyone. But there are laws, supernatural laws, which must be cooperated with in order to receive the things that God has for us. And so it is our misuse of these laws, or our ignorance of these laws, or just our unwillingness to cooperate with these laws that keeps us from receiving what he has given us. And it can actually even result in people dying whenever the healing has already been provided for them. So it's important for us to remove this hindrance of passivity that is keeping us from receiving what he has provided. And so that's one hindrance. We're going to talk about another one next week, which is unbelief. So we can have faith that God has provided something for us, but then our passivity can keep us from receiving what he has provided. Likewise, we can have faith that God has provided something for us, but there can actually be unbelief, which sounds kind of contrary, but we'll explain that a little more next week.